The actions of these homeless triplets changed the life of this millionaire in danger. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The merciless Arizona sun beat down on Richard. Sullivan's exposed skin, like a punishment from above. His once pristine business suit, now torn and stained with sweat and dirt, offered little protection against the brutal heat. His wrists burned where the ropes cut into his flesh, binding him tightly to the massive saguaro cactus that had become his unwilling companion. How long had he been here? Hours? A full day? Time had lost all meaning as dehydration clouded his thoughts. His parched lips had cracked, and his tongue felt like sandpaper against the roof of his mouth. Each desperate attempt to free himself only drove the cactus spines deeper into his back, sending fresh waves of pain through his body. "Help!" Richard tried to shout, but his voice emerged as nothing more than a hoarse whisper that the desert wind quickly carried away. "Somebody! Please!" As the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, fragments of memory flickered through his fading consciousness. The boardroom of Sullivan Developments, the blueprint for Desert Springs Resorts, spread. Across the mahogany table, the voices rising in anger. "You can't just bulldoze 40 families out of their homes, Sullivan," Frank Williams had shouted, his weathered face flushed with rage. "These people have nowhere else to go." Richard had merely adjusted his gold cufflinks, unmoved. "The law is on my side, Mr. Williams. Your little community is sitting on prime real estate, and I've jumped through every legal hoop. You have 48 hours to vacate. After that, it's trespassing." The memory shifted, leaving his office late, the parking garage eerily quiet, a cloth pressed against his face, the chemical smell, darkness. Now here he was, Richard Sullivan, Phoenix's most powerful real estate magnate, reduced to a desperate, dying man in the middle of nowhere, with no one to hear his pleas. "This is how I die," he thought, as a single tear carved a path through the dust on his cheek. "Alone in the desert, I've spent my life developing." The irony wasn't lost on him, even in his deteriorating state. How many lives had he ruined in pursuit of profit? How many families had he displaced with nothing but cold legal notices? Now he would die the same way, discarded and forgotten in the merciless landscape. Just as his eyes began to close, surrendering to the inevitable, something on the horizon caught his attention. 3 small silhouettes shimmered in the heat. Waves rising from the desert floor. A hallucination, surely, his mind's final cruel joke. But the silhouettes grew larger, more defined. 3 identical figures, small and cautious, moving toward him with measured steps. Through swollen eyelids, Richard watched as 3 boys, not just similar but perfectly identical, approached. They couldn't have been more than 10 years, old, dressed in worn clothes that had seen better days. Their faces, though youthful, carried a wisdom and wariness that no child should possess. The boy in the center clutched an old plastic water bottle, its contents sloshing with each step. They stopped several feet away, studying Richard with identical pairs of solemn brown eyes. "Are you the man they brought last night?" one of the boys asked, his voice surprisingly steady. Richard nodded weakly, hope and confusion battling within. His fading consciousness. "We were told not to untie you," another of the boys said softly, "but nobody said we couldn't give you water." The third boy stepped forward, unscrewing the cap from the bottle. "Our mother always said everyone deserves kindness, even when they don't." The 3 identical boys approached Richard cautiously, like desert creatures wary of a trap. Even in his desperate state, Richard couldn't help but notice their remarkable sameness. The same sun-kissed brown hair, the same watchful eyes, the same lean frames hardened by a life far tougher than children should endure. "I'm Jack," said the one who seemed to stand slightly ahead of the others, his voice carrying a natural authority that belied his young age. "These are my brothers, Jason and Joshua." Jason, clutching the water bottle tightly, regarded Richard with suspicion. The men who brought you were really angry. Joshua, whose eyes held a gentleness the others lacked, added softly, "They said you deserved to know what it feels like to lose everything." Richard's parched lips trembled as Jack carefully brought the precious water to his mouth. The cool liquid felt like salvation itself as it trickled down his throat. "Please," Richard gasped between desperate gulps, "please untie me. I'll reward you handsomely. My family must be worried sick." The triplets exchanged identical glances, a silent communication born of shared existence. "We can't," Jack said firmly. "We promise not to." "But we'll come back with more water," Joshua offered quickly, "and maybe some food." Richard studied their worn clothes, the calloused small hands, the premature lines of worry etched around their identical eyes. How do you boys live out here? Where are your parents?" A shadow passed over their young faces. "Our mom died 2 years ago," Jason said, his voice hardening. "We take care of ourselves now." "We have a cabin about a mile from here," Jack explained. "It's not much, but it's home." "What about your father?" Richard asked, the businessman in him automatically searching for accountability, for someone responsible. "Never knew him," Jack answered matter-of-factly. "It was always just us and Mom." As the boys shared their meager water ration, Richard's corporate mind struggled to comprehend their reality. 3 children, barely 10 years old, surviving alone, in one of America's harshest environments. "We do odd jobs in Copper Creek," Jason explained, naming the small town several miles away. "Mrs. Betty at the market gives us day-old bread and vegetables sometimes. And we know which plants we can eat," Joshua added with a hint of pride. "Mom taught us before she—" His voice trailed off, the wound still fresh despite the passage of time. Richard's head spun, and not just from dehydration. These children lived in a parallel America he'd never acknowledged, one without safety nets, where survival depended on kindness and resourcefulness rather than corporate strategies and legal maneuvering. "Why are you helping me?" Richard asked, genuinely perplexed. The triplets looked at each other again, that silent communication flowing between them. "Because you looked thirsty," Joshua said simply. "And scared," added Jason. "And our mom always said we should help people who need it," Jack concluded, his young voice carrying the weight of inherited wisdom. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the boys promised to return. Richard watched their identical silhouettes merge with the desert landscape, 3 small guardians vanishing into the vastness. Left alone with his thoughts, Richard's mind drifted to his last board meeting. The Desert Springs Project. The legal notices, the cold, calculated decisions made in air-conditioned conference rooms. 48 hours' notice is generous, he remembered telling his associates. It's not like these people have much to pack anyway. The cruel irony of his current predicament wasn't lost on him. Bound to the desert he'd spent his career carving up and selling, dependent on the mercy of children who had nothing. For the first time in decades, Richard Sullivan felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, something that felt uncomfortably like shame. True to their word, the triplets returned as the afternoon heat began to wane. This time, they brought a small bundle of food, a half loaf of bread, some dried fruit and jerky, along with a larger container of water. As Richard ate gratefully, the boys settled in the sparse shade of a nearby mesquite tree, watching him with curiosity. "Did you really build that big place with the fountains?" Jack asked suddenly. "The one where rich people stay?" Richard paused mid-bite. "Desert Springs Resort? Yes, that's one of my developments." "We saw it once," Jason said, his voice carefully neutral. "Mom took us there before they made us leave." Something cold settled in Richard's stomach that had nothing to do with the water he'd just consumed. "Leave? You lived near there?" Joshua nodded, drawing patterns in the sand with a stick. "We had a little house. Not fancy, but Mom grew sunflowers. In the front yard, there were about 40 families in our community, Jack continued, his young voice taking on a strange, adult quality. Mechanics, housekeepers, landscapers, people who worked hard. Richard's mind raced, connecting dots. He desperately hoped wouldn't align. When was this? 2 years and 3 months ago, Jason answered precisely. Mum got sick after we had to move to the tent city. The half-eaten food turned to ash in Richard's mouth as memory crashed over him. The Desert Springs Project, his crowning achievement. The legal battle to clear the eyesore community that had been there for generations. The eviction notices his lawyers had crafted so carefully. Your mother, Richard whispered, dreading the answer. What was her name? Sarah. Joshua said softly. Sarah Winters. The name hit Richard like a physical blow. He remembered it from the court documents. One of the community representatives who had pleaded for more time, for compassion, for understanding. He'd never met her face to face, had never imagined her as a real person with 3 identical sons and a garden of sunflowers. She caught pneumonia that winter, Jack continued, his young voice steady despite the pain behind his words. The clinic couldn't help much since we didn't have insurance anymore. By the time Mrs. Betty took her to the hospital in Phoenix, it was too late. Richard closed his eyes, the weight of realization crushing him more effectively than any physical restraint. We stayed in the tent city for a while after, Jason added. But some of the other kids got taken away by social services. So we came here, Joshua finished. To Grandpa's old hunting cabin. Nobody knows we're on our own. Richard stared at the 3 boys, their faces so similar, yet each carrying a different shade of the same grief. Children orphaned by circumstances he had set in motion with the stroke of a pen. You don't recognize us, do you? Jack asked, his penetrating gaze suddenly seeming much older than 10 years. Richard shook his head numbly. Mum took us to one of your meetings. She stood up and asked you to give people more time to find new homes. She showed you our picture. The memory surfaced. A desperate woman holding up a photograph of 3 identical toddlers. My boys need stability, she had pleaded. Just a few more months. I'm so sorry, Richard whispered, the words hopelessly inadequate against the magnitude of what he'd done. Why are you helping me? He asked again, his voice breaking. After what I did, Joshua approached, offering the water bottle again. Mom always said hate makes the heart heavy, and our hearts are heavy enough already. As twilight descended over the desert, Richard's mind became a churning sea of memories, each more damning than the last. The faces of the triplets, Jack, Jason, and Joshua, blurred with images from boardroom presentations and courtroom victories. We had to move out so fast that Mom couldn't take everything, Jason was saying, absent-mindedly arranging small rocks in a perfect line. She cried about leaving her sewing machine behind. It was Grandma's. The bulldozers came the next day, Jack added, his young voice flat. We watched from the hillside. Mom covered our eyes, but we could still hear. Each word drove the knife of guilt deeper into Richard's heart. He remembered the demolition schedule, how he'd insisted it start immediately after the legal deadline to prevent any unfortunate squatting attempts. He'd even visited the site that day, watching from his air-conditioned Mercedes as the community was reduced to rubble. Where did everyone go? Richard asked, his voice barely audible. Some had family they could stay with, Jack answered. The luckier ones. Others went to shelters or the tent city by the riverbed. Mrs. Betty says some of them are still homeless. Joshua added softly. Mr. Ramirez died last summer. He was old and couldn't handle the heat without his home. Names and faces Richard had never known. Collateral damage in what he had viewed as simple business strategy. Human beings whose lives he had shattered without a second thought. I didn't know, Richard whispered. I never thought about what would happen to everyone. Mom said, people like you never do. Jason replied, without malice. just stating a simple truth as he understood it. The brutal honesty from a child's mouth struck Richard harder than any adult accusation could have. In his world of corporate law and development projects, people like the Winters family had been abstract obstacles, not flesh and blood. Not a devoted mother and 3 remarkable boys trying to survive. "Your mother sounds like she was an extraordinary woman," Richard said, fighting back tears. Joshua's face softened. "She was. She taught kindergarten before the school closed. She could tell us apart even when no one else could. She made up different bedtime stories for each of us," Jason added, a rare smile crossing his face. "Mine always had dragons, and she never gave up," Jack said firmly. "Even when things got really bad, she told us that kindness matters most when it's hardest to give." Richard thought of his own daughter, Chloe, surrounded by luxury and privilege, yet often distant and unhappy, of his wife Margaret, who measured her worth in designer labels and country club memberships. What values had he passed on to his family? "Why are you helping me?" Richard asked for the 3rd time, needing to understand. "I'm the reason your mother died. I'm the reason you're living like this. You should hate me." Joshua approached the cactus where Richard remained bound and placed a small hand on his arm, the first human touch Richard had felt since his abduction. "Mum always said that hate is easy," the boy said softly. "Forgiveness is the brave choice. But that doesn't mean there shouldn't be justice," Jack added, his young eyes serious. Richard nodded, something resolving within him. "You're right. There should be justice. And there will be." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Richard made a silent vow. If he survived this ordeal, he would dedicate the rest of his life to making amends, not just to these 3 remarkable boys, but to every family whose life he had carelessly destroyed in pursuit of profit. "I think they're coming back," Jason said suddenly, his head tilted as he listened to the distant sound of an approaching vehicle. Richard tensed, remembering his kidnappers, but instead of fear, he felt a strange sense of readiness for whatever. Judgment awaited him. The headlights cut through the gathering darkness, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The triplets stood their ground as the pickup truck rumbled to a stop nearby, dust billowing around its weathered frame. 3 men emerged, working men with faces hardened by sun and struggle. The leader, a tall figure with deep lines etched around determined eyes, stopped short at the sight of the 3 boys standing near Richard. "Jack, Jason, Joshua," he exclaimed, his voice a mixture of surprise and concern. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" "Hello, Mr. Williams," Jack replied calmly. "We were bringing him water." Frank Williams. Richard recognized him now. From the community meetings and court appearances, looked from the boys to their captive, his expression darkening. "You boys shouldn't be involved in this," he said firmly. "This isn't your concern." "It is our concern," Jason countered with unexpected boldness. "He's the man who took our home." The second man stepped forward, his face registering shock. "These are Sarah's boys. Sarah Winters." "Yes, Pete," Frank confirmed grimly. "Sarah's triplets." The third man removed his hat, shaking his head. "We never meant for you boys to see this. This was between us and Sullivan." Richard watched the interaction with growing clarity. These weren't professional kidnappers or violent criminals. They were desperate men driven to desperate measures, former residents of the community he had destroyed. "What were you planning to do with me?" Richard asked, his voice steadier than he expected. Frank turned to him, eyes burning with contained fury. "Nothing that would leave a mark, Sullivan. Just leave you out here long enough to know what it feels like to lose everything, to be exposed, helpless, at the mercy of forces you can't control." He gestured around at the desert. "To know what it's like when your world is reduced to survival." Richard nodded slowly. "Like what happened to your families when I evicted you." A flicker of surprise crossed Frank's weathered face, quickly replaced by suspicion. Don't tell me a day in the sun has suddenly given you a conscience. Not the sun, Richard replied, looking at the three identical boys. They did. Richard took a deep breath. I deserve to be here. What I did to your community, to these boys and their mother, it was unforgivable. I can't bring back Sarah Winters or Mr. Ramirez. I can't undo the suffering I caused, but I can try to make amends. Frank scoffed. With money? That's always. The answer for men like you? No, Richard said firmly. With change. Real change. He looked directly at Frank. I'll provide new homes for every family that lost theirs. I'll create a fund for medical care, education, whatever the community needs. And these boys, his voice caught, I'll personally ensure they have everything they need for a good future. Pretty words from a desperate man, Pete muttered. Joshua stepped forward suddenly, his young face solemn. He means it, Mr. Williams, I can tell. The three men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly thrown by this unexpected development. Untie me, Richard said quietly. Not because I've suffered enough, I haven't. Untie me so I can start fixing what I broke. After a long, tense moment, Frank nodded to his companions. As the ropes fell away, Richard massaged his raw wrists, then surprised everyone by remaining seated on the ground, looking up at the circle of faces illuminated by the truck's headlights. I make this promise here and now, he said solemnly. I will dedicate my resources, and the rest of my life to, rebuilding what I destroyed, starting with these boys. Frank studied him with narrowed eyes. And if we just let you walk away, what guarantee do we have that you won't call the police the minute you're back in Phoenix? Richard stood slowly, wincing as his stiff muscles protested. You have my word, and more importantly, you'll have my actions, starting tomorrow. The small town of Copper Creek existed in a different world from Richard Sullivan's Phoenix. A single main street lined with modest businesses, many with faded signs and peeling paint, spoke of a community hanging on by sheer determination. Frank Williams's pickup truck pulled up in front of Betty's Market and Sundries, drawing curious glances. From the few locals out in the early evening, Richard, still disheveled but standing tall, stepped out with the triplets close by his side. You sure about this? Frank asked gruffly. Betty was Sarah's best friend. She's got no love for you. Richard nodded. I need to start somewhere. These boys trust her, and I need to earn that trust too. The bell above the door jingled as they entered the small market. Behind the counter stood a formidable woman in her 60s, grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, sharp eyes taking in the unlikely group that had just walked in. Her expression transformed from curiosity to shock, then to cold fury as she recognized Richard. Frank Williams, what in heaven's name is he doing in my store? She demanded, coming around the counter with surprising speed. Mrs. Betty, Jack spoke up before anyone else could. He's going to help us. Betty's eyes softened as she looked at the boys, then hardened again as they returned to Richard. This is the man who destroyed our community, who cost your mother her life. I know, Richard said quietly, and nothing I can do will ever make that right, but I'm here to try. For the next hour, Richard outlined his plans in Betty's back office. Concrete, specific promises about housing, healthcare, education. Not vague, charitable gestures, but detailed commitments with timelines and budgets. He spoke of setting up a trust for the triplets, of rebuilding homes on land adjacent to the resort, of creating a community center named after Sarah Winters. Betty remained skeptical, her arms crossed firmly over her chest. Fine words from a man who's built his fortune on broken promises. Then judge me by my actions, Richard replied, starting right now. He pulled out his phone and made a call, putting it on speaker. Margaret, I need you to contact James at the office. Have him start paperwork to transfer $3 million to a new account. I'll send details shortly. Betty's eyebrows rose, but her expression remained guarded. "Money doesn't fix everything, Mr. Sullivan." "No," Richard agreed, "but it's the tool I have, and I intend to use it better than I have in the past." He turned to the triplets, who had been watching the adult conversation with solemn attention. "Boys, how would you feel about starting school here in Copper Creek? Properly, I mean." Their identical faces registered surprise, then cautious hope. "We've been teaching ourselves," Jason explained, "from Mom's old textbooks. And we go to the library sometimes," Joshua added. "But real school?" Jack asked, a rare childlike excitement breaking through his serious demeanor. "With other kids and everything?" Richard nodded, something warm expanding in his chest at their reaction. "Everything, proper clothes, supplies, lunches, whatever you need. And we'd still stay in our cabin?" Jason asked cautiously. Richard looked to Betty, understanding dawning. These remarkable children had been living alone, under the radar of social services, with Betty as their discreet guardian angel. "For now," Richard said carefully, "until we figure out something better, together." As the sun set over Copper Creek, casting long shadows through the market windows, Richard found himself making more promises, not the empty corporate kind he'd dispensed throughout his career, but sacred vows that would reshape his entire existence. Later, as Frank drove him back toward Phoenix in silence, Richard stared out at the desert landscape transformed by twilight. The saguaro cacti stood like sentinels against the purple sky, the same ancient plants that had witnessed his humiliation and rebirth. "They're extraordinary boys," Richard said finally, breaking the long silence. Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "They're survivors, like their mother was." "I'm going to protect them," Richard vowed, "and honor her memory through them." Frank glanced at him, measuring his sincerity. "You realize what you're getting into, changing your whole life for 3 kids you just met?" Richard nodded, thinking of his mansion in Scottsdale, his wife Margaret, his teenage daughter Chloe, the family he'd neglected while building his empire, of the emptiness that had been growing inside him for years, unacknowledged until 3 identical boys had offered water to the man who had destroyed their lives. "I'm not changing my life for them," Richard replied, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "They've already changed it. I'm just following where that leads." The security gate to Richard's Scottsdale estate swung open, revealing a world that now felt strangely foreign to him. The manicured lawns, ornate fountains, and imposing Mediterranean-style mansion seemed like props on a stage rather than his home of 15 years. Frank's weathered pickup truck looked comically out of place in the circular driveway, lined with Margaret's prized rose bushes. "You sure you don't want me to call the police?" Frank asked, eyeing the mansion with distaste. "Kidnapping's a serious charge." Richard shook his head. "What happened in the desert stays there." "I meant what I said, Frank." As Frank drove away, Richard stood for a moment, taking in his surroundings with new eyes. The fountain alone had cost more than what most Copper Creek families earned in a year. The massive front door flew open before he could reach it. "Richard!" Margaret rushed toward him, her designer dress and perfectly styled blonde hair at odds with her uncharacteristic display of emotion. Behind her stood Chloe, their 16-year-old daughter, her expression a mixture of relief and characteristic teenage detachment. "Where have you been?" Margaret demanded, her initial relief quickly transitioning to anger. 3 days without a word. The board is in chaos. The police have been searching. I've been out of my mind with worry." Richard embraced his wife, noting how stiff she felt in his arms. Had they always been this disconnected? "I'm sorry for frightening you," he said quietly, "but I'm fine." Better than fine, actually. Inside the marble-floored foyer, Richard sank into a plush sofa, suddenly aware of his disheveled appearance and the desert dust still clinging to his torn clothing. "And Dad, you look terrible." Chloe observed, studying him with newfound curiosity. "What happened to you?" Over the next hour, Richard explained everything: the kidnapping, the desert, the triplets, and most importantly, the promises he had made. As he spoke, Margaret's expression shifted from concern to disbelief to outright horror. "Have you lost your mind?" she finally interrupted. "You're talking about giving away millions of dollars to the very people who abducted you, about building houses for squatters who have no legal claim to anything." "They weren't squatters, Margaret," Richard replied calmly. "They were families, hard-working people whose lives I destroyed for profit. It was a business decision," Margaret countered, her voice rising. "One that made us very wealthy, may I remind you." Richard looked around at their opulent surroundings. The crystal chandelier that cost more than a Copper Creek family's annual income, the original artwork that Margaret collected but barely noticed, the emptiness disguised as luxury. "At 82, what cost?" he asked softly. Chloe, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Tell me more about the triplets, Dad." Richard's face softened. "They're remarkable, Chloe. 10 years old and surviving on their own. Smart, resilient, and despite everything they've lost, still capable of kindness. And you're just going to what? Adopt them?" Margaret demanded. "Not exactly," Richard replied. "But I am going to make sure they're taken care of, them and everyone else from that community." Margaret stood abruptly. "You need to see a psychiatrist. This is Stockholm Syndrome, or a nervous breakdown, or it's clarity," Richard interrupted. "For the first time in years, I see things as they really are." Later that night, as Margaret slept fitfully beside him, Richard stood at their bedroom window, looking out at the city lights in the distance. He thought of the triplets in their humble cabin, of their mother Sarah, who had died because of his actions, of the lives he had carelessly destroyed in pursuit of wealth. His phone buzzed with a text from Betty. "Boys registered for school tomorrow. They're excited but nervous. This better not be a game to you, Sullivan." Richard typed back, "It's not a game, it's redemption." As he set down his phone, he caught sight of his reflection in the window. A man he barely recognized anymore, standing at the crossroads of who he had been and who he needed to become. The Sullivan family breakfast table had never been a place of deep conversation, but the silence that morning was particularly heavy. Margaret sipped her coffee and scrolled through her social calendar, pointedly ignoring Richard. Chloe pushed her eggs around her plate, glancing between her parents. "With unusual attentiveness, I've scheduled a meeting with our attorneys this morning," Richard finally said, "to start the paperwork for the Community Trust and the Triplets Education Fund." Margaret set down her cup with deliberate precision. "The board of directors is meeting at 11. They deserve an explanation for your episode." "It wasn't an episode," Richard replied evenly. "And yes, they do deserve an explanation. I'll tell them exactly what I've told you. That you're giving away millions to strangers because 3 days in the desert gave you an epiphany?" Margaret's laugh was brittle. "They'll have you declared incompetent by noon." The words hung in the air between them, a threat barely veiled. "Perhaps they will," Richard acknowledged, "but it won't change what I'm going to do." Later that morning, Richard faced his board of directors, men and women he'd chosen for their ruthless business acumen, their dedication to the bottom line above all else. People he realized with growing discomfort, exactly like the person he'd been a week ago. "This is corporate suicide," Gerald Hawkins, his CFO, declared after Richard outlined his plans. "The shareholders will revolt. The stock will plummet." "Then let it," Richard replied. "I still maintain controlling interest, and my mind is made up." By afternoon, rumors of Richard Sullivan's mental breakdown had begun circulating through Phoenix's business community. Margaret returned from her ladies' luncheon, her face tight with humiliation. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she demanded. "My phone hasn't stopped ringing. Everyone is talking about us, about you losing your mind and throwing away our future on some guilt-driven charity project." Richard looked at his wife, really looked at her, and wondered when they had become such strangers. When had status and appearance become her entire identity? "I'm sorry this is difficult for you," he said gently, "but this isn't about charity. It's about justice." "Justice?" Margaret's voice rose sharply. "What about justice for your family? For Chloe's future? What about my future?" Chloe asked from the doorway, startling them both. Margaret turned to her daughter, seizing the opportunity. "Your father is risking everything, your college fund, our security, our position in the community, for some homeless children he just met." Chloe studied her father with thoughtful eyes. "Are they really orphans living alone in the desert, Dad?" Richard nodded. "They're extraordinary kids, Chloe, and they've been through more than you can imagine. Because of your business decisions," Margaret added pointedly. To both their surprise, Chloe straightened her shoulders. "Then maybe Dad's right. Maybe he should fix what he broke." Margaret stared at their daughter in shock. "You can't possibly understand the implications." "I understand that Dad's trying to do something good," Chloe interrupted, a new firmness in her voice. "When was the last time either of you did that? Really did something that helped people instead of just writing checks at galas?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortably accurate. In the tense silence that followed, Richard made a decision. "Chloe, would you like to meet them, the triplets?" Something lit up in his daughter's eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or the hunger for something more meaningful than the privileged but hollow existence she'd known. "I would, actually." Margaret's face hardened into a mask of dignified fury. "If you take her to that place, Richard, we need to seriously reconsider our marriage." Richard looked between his wife and daughter, feeling the weight of the choice before him. "What matters more?" he asked quietly. "Having everything we want, or being people we can be proud of?" The question lingered, unanswered but revealing, as evening descended on the Sullivan household. The old station wagon Richard had borrowed from one of his employees, his Mercedes seemed obscenely inappropriate, kicked up dust as it travelled. Down the unpaved road leading to Copper Creek, beside him, Chloe stared out the window at the desert landscape, her usual teen indifference replaced by quiet anticipation. "They might be shy at first," Richard cautioned. "They've been through a lot." Chloe nodded, fidgeting with the friendship bracelets on her wrist, tokens from girls at her exclusive private school who measured friendship in brand names and social media followers. Betty's Market came into view, its faded sign a landmark in the small town. Standing outside were three identical figures in matching blue shirts and khaki pants, new school uniforms that still held their department store creases. "Is that them?" Chloe asked, leaning forward. Richard nodded, his heart unexpectedly full, at the sight of the triplets waiting as promised. As he parked, he noted the protective presence of Betty, watching from the store entrance, her arms crossed in cautious vigilance. Jack was the first to approach as they exited the car, his natural leadership evident even in this small action. "Hello, Mr. Sullivan," he said formally, then turned curious eyes to Chloe. "Boys, this is my daughter Chloe," Richard introduced. "Chloe, these are Jack, Jason, and Joshua Winters." Chloe, usually so poised in social situations, suddenly seemed unsure. "Hi," she said simply. "My dad's told me about you." Joshua, the most naturally empathetic of the three, sensed her discomfort. "Do you want to see our school? We just started yesterday." The small elementary school was a source of obvious pride for the triplets. Jack showed Chloe his essay that had already earned a place on the classroom wall. Jason eagerly displayed his collection of desert rocks that the science teacher had asked him to present to the class. Joshua, naturally theatrical, made Chloe laugh with his impressions of his new classmates. "They're all so different," Chloe marveled to her father as the boys ran ahead to show her the playground. "I mean, they look exactly the same, but they're Like completely different people. Their mother must have been remarkable, Richard replied, to raise such extraordinary boys on her own, especially in difficult circumstances. As the children explored the playground, Richard met with the school principal, finalizing arrangements for the boys' education. He established accounts for their supplies, meals, and future needs, making it clear that the school should contact him directly with any concerns. "They're very bright," the principal noted. "Despite gaps in their formal education, they're testing well above grade level in several subjects. Their mother must have been quite dedicated to their learning." Later, as they all shared ice cream at the town's only diner, Richard felt a strange sense of rightness that had been missing from his life for years. Chloe was animated, asking the boys endless questions about desert life, their survival skills, their favorite books and games. "Dad, they've never been to a movie theater," she reported, astonished, "or an aquarium, or even a shopping mall." "Perhaps we could change that," Richard suggested, watching the way the 4 children had already formed a connection. "If the boys would like to visit Phoenix sometime." 3 identical faces lit up with excitement, then looked to each other in their silent communication. "We'd have to ask Mrs. Betty," Jack said practically. "She worries about us." "And we can't leave our cabin for too long," Jason added. "We have responsibilities," Richard nodded, respecting their sense of duty. "Of course, we'll make proper arrangements." As the day drew to a close, Chloe surprised everyone by hugging each boy goodbye. "I'll come back soon," she promised. "Maybe I can help with your English homework. That's my best subject." On the drive back to Scottsdale, Chloe was thoughtful. "Dad, those boys have nothing, but they seem happier than most kids I know." Richard considered this. "They have each other, and they know what really matters." "I want to help them too," Chloe decided, "not just with money and stuff. I want to actually help." Something shifted in Richard's chest. Pride, hope, love for this daughter who was revealing depths he hadn't recognized before. "I think," he said carefully, "that would mean more to them than anything else we could give them." Margaret Sullivan checked her appearance one final time in the car's visor mirror. Her Chanel sunglasses, cashmere sweater, and perfectly styled hair were armor against the dusty reality of Copper Creek. "I still can't believe I agreed to this," she muttered, closing the mirror with a snap. Richard, who had learned to be patient during the 2 weeks of negotiations that led to this visit, simply nodded. "Thank you for coming. It means a lot to me and to Chloe." Their daughter had already exited the car and was waving excitedly to the triplets, who stood waiting outside Betty's market. In the short time since meeting them, Chloe had transformed, calling the boys daily, sending them books and school supplies, even starting a project at her private school to support the rebuilding of Copper Creek. Margaret watched her daughter embrace each identical boy with genuine affection, her expression a mixture of confusion and reluctant curiosity. "They really are identical," she observed. "How do you tell them apart?" "Jack stands the straightest. He's the natural leader. Jason tends to hang back a bit and observe, and Joshua's eyes are always looking for ways to connect with people," Richard explained. "Once you know them, it's impossible to confuse them." Betty emerged from the market, her expression guarded as she approached Margaret. 2 women from entirely different worlds, sizing each other up with wary respect. "Mrs. Sullivan," Betty acknowledged, "the boys have been excited about your visit. They cleaned their cabin 3 times yesterday." Margaret blinked, clearly surprised by this information. "They wanted to impress me?" "They want to thank you," Betty corrected, "for sharing your husband and daughter with them." The small cabin that the triplets called home was humble but meticulously clean. Handmade curtains hung at the windows, and each boy had a small space that reflected his personality. Jack's neat and organized, Jason's filled with books and collected specimens, Joshua's decorated with drawings and small treasures. "You live here alone?" Margaret asked, unable to mask her shock. Jack nodded. "Since Mom died." Mrs. Betty checks on us, and now Mr. Sullivan visits too. And Chloe calls us every day, Joshua added with a bright smile. Margaret wandered the small space, taking in the patched clothes carefully folded in a drawer, the single pot on the small stove, the 3 identical backpacks lined up by the door. This wasn't poverty as an abstract concept. This was childhood stripped to its barest essentials. "Would you like some tea, Mrs. Sullivan?" Jason offered formally. "We don't have fancy kinds, but Mom always said tea makes guests feel welcome." Something shifted in Margaret's carefully composed expression. "That would be lovely, Jason. Thank you." As the day progressed, Margaret remained mostly silent, observing the easy rapport between Richard, Chloe, and the triplets. They toured the small town, visited the boys' school, and reviewed the architectural plans for the new community development that Richard had already set in motion. The defining moment came unexpectedly. While the children played an impromptu game of baseball in a dusty lot, Jason took a hard fall while diving for the ball. His identical brothers rushed to him immediately, but it was Margaret who reached him first, her designer clothes forgotten as she knelt in the dirt. "Let me see," she said with surprising gentleness, examining his scraped elbow with the expertise of a mother. "It's not too bad, but we should clean it." From her purse, which Richard knew usually contained little more than makeup and credit, cards, Margaret produced a small first aid kit. With tender efficiency, she cleaned and bandaged Jason's elbow, then helped him to his feet. "My mom used to do that," Jason said quietly. "You're good at it, like her." Margaret's carefully constructed facade cracked visibly, revealing something vulnerable beneath. "I used to bandage Chloe's scrapes too when she was younger, before she decided she was too grown up for mother's care." That evening, as they shared a simple meal at the diner, Margaret watched the 3 boys sharing a single ice cream sundae, their identical faces alight with simple joy. Her expression had softened, the rigid defensiveness gradually replaced by thoughtful observation. On the drive back to Scottsdale, after the emotional goodbyes and promises to return soon, Margaret broke the long silence. "Those boys," she said, quietly, "they have nothing, and yet they have everything that really matters," Richard finished. Margaret turned to him, her eyes showing a vulnerability he hadn't seen in years. "We've lost something, haven't we? Somewhere along the way." Richard reached for her hand, feeling a connection that had been missing for longer than he cared to admit. "We can find it again." That night, husband and wife sat on their patio, overlooking the lights of Phoenix, talking honestly for the first time in decades about values, purpose, regrets, and second chances. 6 months passed in a whirlwind of activity. The first homes in the new community, officially named Winter's Crossing in honor of the triplets' mother, were nearing completion. Local news crews gathered for the ceremony as Richard handed over keys to the first families, many of whom had been displaced by his Desert Springs project years earlier. "This isn't charity," Richard stated clearly to the assembled reporters. "This is restoration. These families always deserved homes. I'm simply returning what should never have been taken." The triplets, now more confident and healthier than when Richard first met them, stood proudly nearby, though still living in their cabin, with significant improvements to its plumbing, insulation and furnishings. They had become the heart of the rebuilding project. Local residents, once suspicious of Richard's intentions, had come to accept his presence largely through their connection to the boys everyone in town had quietly watched over. "Mr. Sullivan," called one reporter, "your company's stock has dropped 15% since you announced this project. Any response to shareholders' concerns?" Richard smiled. "I'd invite those shareholders to come here today to see what real value looks like. It's not always measured in dollars." Margaret, standing beside him in a simple dress that would have been unthinkable in her previous wardrobe, squeezed his hand in support. Her transformation had been perhaps the most surprising of all, from reluctant visitor to passionate advocate. She now spent 3 days a week in Copper Creek, coordinating educational programs and healthcare initiatives. After the formal ceremony, Richard gathered everyone for an additional announcement. "Today we break ground on a new project," he said, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd. "The Sarah Winters Community Center, which will include a free medical clinic, educational facilities, and resources for all residents." As applause broke out, Richard gestured for the triplets to join him. Jack, always the spokesman, approached the microphone with characteristic composure. "Our mom always told us that community means taking care of each other," he said, his young voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. "She would be happy to see everyone coming together like this." Jason, typically reserved, added his own thoughts. "She got sick because we didn't have proper health care after losing our home. This clinic will help make sure that doesn't happen to other families." Joshua, his expressive eyes scanning the crowd, concluded simply, "Thank you for remembering. Our mom, she was the best person we knew." There wasn't a dry eye in the gathering as the 3 identical boys stood together, their growth over the past months evident not just in their healthier appearances, but in their growing confidence and sense of purpose. Later, as the celebration continued, Chloe sought out her father. At 17, she had matured remarkably, her former self-absorption replaced by genuine empathy and purpose. "Dad, I've made a decision about college," she said, determination in her voice. "I'm going to study social work and community development. I want to make a difference, like we're doing here." Richard embraced his daughter, pride overwhelming him. "Your mother and I will support whatever path you choose." "Speaking of Mom," Chloe added with a smile, "have you seen what she's doing?" Across the gathering, Margaret Sullivan, once concerned only with country club memberships and social standing, was organizing a group of women from both Copper Creek and Scottsdale, building connections between 2 worlds that had previously existed in parallel but separate universes. Frank Williams approached Richard, extending his hand. Their relationship had evolved from kidnapper and victim to cautious allies to something approaching friendship. "You've kept your word, Sullivan," Frank acknowledged. "I didn't think you had it in you." Richard shook the offered hand. "Neither did I, Frank. It took losing everything to see what really matters." As the sun began to set over Winter's Crossing, Richard watched the triplets, his 3 unexpected teachers, playing with other children on the new community playground. In their joyful faces, he saw not just the future of this small town, but his own redemption story, still unfolding one promise at a time. The sign at the entrance to Winter's Crossing gleamed in the morning sunlight. A community of compassion and growth. What had begun as a restoration project had evolved into a model development, drawing visitors from across the country who came to study its innovative approach to affordable housing, sustainable design, and community integration. Richard Sullivan, his hair now threaded with silver, stood on the observation deck of the community center, watching the bustling activity below. 5 years had transformed not just the landscape, but the people, himself included. Sullivan Developments had been completely restructured, its mission redirected toward ethical, accessible housing projects. The company's initial stock plunge had been followed by a gradual, steady rise as Richard demonstrated that profitability and social responsibility could coexist. He'd bought out dissenting shareholders, assembled a new board of directors who shared his vision, and now led a company that bore little resemblance to its former self. "Quarterly reports are in," said Margaret, joining him at the railing. "The Phoenix East project is ahead of schedule and under budget." Margaret now served as the foundation's director, her organizational skills and social connections repurposed to support their growing network of community initiatives. The diamond tennis bracelets and designer shoes had been replaced by practical clothing, and a laptop perpetually open to spreadsheets tracking program effectiveness. "And how are the boys doing with exams?" Richard asked, his thoughts never far. "From the triplets, even as their projects expanded." Margaret smiled. "Jack's student council meetings run until 5, but he's studying with Joshua tonight. Jason's science project is taking up the entire garage, but Betty says his physics scores are the highest in the school." At 15, the Winters boys remained identical in appearance, but had developed even more distinct personalities and interests. Jack had emerged as a natural community leader, already mentoring younger children and organizing student initiatives. Jason's scientific mind had flourished with proper education and resources, his understanding of desert ecology earning recognition from university researchers. Joshua, with his natural empathy, had become a peer counselor, helping other children navigate trauma and loss. The Sullivan home, relocated from Scottsdale to a modest but comfortable house in Winters Crossing, had become their second home, with the boys still maintaining their cabin, now fully renovated, as their primary residence. The unusual arrangement had raised eyebrows initially, but the community had come to understand the importance of honoring the boys' independence while providing the support they needed. "Mom, Dad," Chloe's voice called from below. Now 22, and in her final year of college, she had grown into a poised young woman with a clear sense of purpose. "The tour group from San Francisco is here." Richard watched with pride as his daughter greeted the visitors. Representatives from a California non-profit interested in replicating the Winters Crossing model. Her understanding of both the technical and human elements of their work made her an ideal ambassador. Later that evening, the expanded Sullivan Winters family gathered for their weekly dinner, a tradition that had evolved organically over the years. Betty brought her famous apple pie, Frank contributed vegetables from the community garden, and the triplets arrived. With their usual energy and stories from school, after dinner, Richard found himself drawn to the boys' bedroom, a space they used during their frequent overnight stays. Despite their age and growing independence, the triplets still maintained one tradition from their years alone in the cabin, gathering together before sleep to share thoughts, concerns, and dreams. Richard paused in the doorway, listening to their quiet conversation. "Ms. Rodriguez says my essay on community development could win the state competition," Jack was saying, his voice deeper now but still carrying that natural authority. "The solar panel design is almost ready for testing," Jason reported. "If it works, it could help power the new clinic expansion. Ethan's dad finally found a job," Joshua added. "He stopped by the Peer Center today and actually smiled, first time since they moved here." Richard felt a presence beside him and turned to find Margaret watching the boys with the same wonder he felt. "How did we get so lucky?" she whispered. "We didn't deserve it," Richard replied honestly. But they gave us a second chance anyway." As they retreated to give the boys their privacy, Richard reflected on how a simple act of kindness, 3 boys offering water to the man who had destroyed their lives, had created ripples that continued to expand, transforming not just one family, but an entire community. In the living room, Chloe was spreading out blueprints for her senior project, a proposal for expanding the Winters Crossing model to a struggling neighborhood in Phoenix. Her passion and competence reminded Richard daily of how much they had all grown. "Sometimes I wonder what Sarah would think," Richard said quietly to Margaret as they watched their daughter work. "If she could see her boys now and what they helped create." Margaret's eyes softened. "I think she knows, Richard. Somehow, I think she knows." The grand opening of the Sullivan Williams Center for Family Support marked a milestone that few could have imagined 5 years earlier. Located on the exact site where the original community had stood before Desert Springs Resort, the complex stood as a testament to transformation and healing. the center's architecture seamlessly integrated with the desert landscape. Solar panels capturing Arizona's abundant sunlight, rainwater harvesting systems conserving precious resources, and indigenous plants covering the green roof. But more impressive than its sustainable design was what it represented, the complete circle of Richard Sullivan's journey from destroyer to rebuilder. Frank Williams, once Richard's kidnapper and now his partner in community development, stood beside him on the podium, both men older but energized by purpose. "When Frank first tied me to that cactus," Richard began, drawing surprised laughter from the audience, "I never imagined we'd be standing here together. But that's the power of transformation. People can change, communities can heal, wrongs can be made right, not erased, but transformed into foundations for something better." The crowd gathered for the opening represented the bridge that had been built between worlds. Residents from Copper Creek and Winter's Crossing alongside, business leaders, government officials, and social advocates from across the state. Margaret and Betty, once from opposite ends of the social spectrum, now worked side by side, coordinating the center's family support programs. The Triplets, now 15, had insisted on creating a special memorial section within the center. Jack, with his growing oratorical skills, addressed the gathering. "5 years ago, we were 3 kids living alone in a cabin, still grieving our mom," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Today, we're part of something bigger than ourselves. This center isn't just a building, it's a promise that no family will face what ours did." Jason, whose scientific aptitude had blossomed into genuine brilliance, had designed several of the center's environmental systems. "The solar array will generate enough power for the entire complex, with excess feeding back to the community grid," he explained, his quiet pride evident. Joshua, whose empathetic nature had developed into a gift for counseling, had helped design the center's mental health spaces. "Every room is created to feel safe and welcoming," he shared, "because healing happens when people feel they belong." The emotional pinnacle came when the 4 teenagers, the Triplets and Chloe Sullivan, together unveiled a simple but beautiful bronze plaque dedicated to Sarah Winters, whose love for her children taught us all what family truly means. Margaret, who had undergone perhaps the most surprising transformation of all, stepped forward with her own announcement. "Today I'm proud to launch the Sarah Winters Scholarship Fund," she said, her voice clear and purposeful. "Every child from Winter's Crossing and Copper Creek will have the opportunity for higher education, regardless of their financial circumstances." As Richard watched his wife, once concerned only with social status and material wealth, pledge millions to educational access for children she would once have ignored, he felt the full weight of their collective journey. The ceremony transitioned to a community celebration, with food, music, and tours of the new facility. Richard found a quiet moment to stand beside the memorial plaque, tracing Sarah Winters' name with his finger. "I wish I'd known her," he said softly to Betty, who had appeared silently beside him. "She would have forgiven you," Betty replied, her initial hostility long since replaced by respect. "That's who she was, and she would be so proud of her boys, not just for what they've accomplished, but for the men they're becoming." Richard nodded, understanding the profound truth in her words. "They saved me, you know, not just from the desert, but from myself." As evening fell, the Sullivan-Williams Center was illuminated against the desert sky, its lights a beacon visible for miles around. For Richard, it represented not just redemption, but the possibility that even the most broken systems and people could be transformed when enough hearts committed to change. In a quiet corner of the celebration, Frank Williams raised his glass in a private toast with Richard. "To second chances," Frank said simply. Richard clinked his glass against his former captor's, and to the kids who made us believe in them. Harvard Law has an excellent social justice program, Jack said, spreading brochures across the kitchen table. Their housing rights clinic is doing groundbreaking work. MIT's Environmental Engineering Department just received that major grant for sustainable desert development, Jason added, his eyes bright with possibility. Stanford's psychology program has the trauma recovery specialization I'm interested in, Joshua contributed more quietly. Richard and Margaret exchanged glances across the table, pride and bittersweet anticipation mingling in their expressions. The triplets, weeks away from their high school graduation at 18, stood at a crossroads that would inevitably lead them away from Winter's Crossing. "You boys could attend any university in the country," Richard acknowledged. "Your academic records and community work have seen to that. And distance shouldn't be a factor in your decisions," Margaret added supportively. "Technology makes the world smaller than ever." The conversation was interrupted by Chloe's arrival. Now 25, she had completed her master's degree and returned to Winter's Crossing to lead community development initiatives. Her presence had helped ease the inevitable separation anxiety as the triplets approached adulthood. "College talk?" she asked, immediately reading the atmosphere. "Let me guess. Jack wants the East Coast, Jason is thinking about research opportunities, and Joshua is considering where he can help the most people." The triplets laughed at her accurate assessment, the identical sound a reminder of their unique bond despite their diverging paths. Later that evening, as sunset painted the desert in spectacular hues, the extended family gathered at a special place. The saguaro cactus, where Richard had been tied 8 years earlier. What had once been a site of humiliation and reckoning had been transformed into a place of reflection and gratitude, visited annually to mark their journey. Frank Williams was there, now a community elder whose wisdom helped guide the expansion of their model to other areas. Betty, her hair now fully silver but her spirit undimmed, brought her traditional picnic basket. Several other residents joined them, the gathering having evolved into an informal tradition marking the community's rebirth. As they shared food and memories under the desert sky, Richard felt a familiar sense of amazement at how completely his life had changed. The ambitious, ruthless developer who had once destroyed communities for profit had been replaced by a man dedicated to building them with purpose and compassion. "I received an interesting offer today," Richard said during a lull in the conversation. "Global Community Partners wants to buy Sullivan Developments. The figure they're offering is substantial." A hush fell over the gathering. Despite its transformation, Sullivan Developments remained the economic engine that powered much of their work. "Would they continue our mission?" Jack asked, immediately focusing on the heart of the matter. Richard shrugged. "They say they would, but corporate promises are easy to make and easier to break. I should know." "What are you thinking, Dad?" Chloe asked. Studying her father's expression, Richard looked around the circle, at Margaret, whose purpose now ran deeper than social status had ever allowed, at Chloe, whose compassionate leadership continued to surprise him, at Frank and Betty, who had found ways to transform justified anger into collaborative action, and finally at the triplets, those extraordinary young men who had offered water to the man who destroyed their lives. "I'm thinking about legacy," he answered honestly, "about what we've built together and how to ensure it continues." As stars appeared in the darkening sky, each person shared their reflections on the journey they had traveled together and their hopes for the future. When Joshua's turn came, his sensitive insight cut to the heart of the matter. 8 years ago, we were 3 kids with nothing but each other, he said softly. Now we have all of you, a family bigger than we ever imagined. Whatever decisions we make, that connection doesn't change. As the gathering drew to a close, Richard found himself standing slightly apart, looking out over the desert landscape where his transformation had begun. The resort he had once prioritized over human lives now existed in harmony with the community that surrounded it, providing employment without exploitation. Margaret joined him, slipping her hand into his, a gesture that had regained its meaning. Through years of shared purpose, whatever you decide about the company, she said quietly, we'll face it together. Richard nodded, thinking of the young men who would soon spread their wings beyond Winter's Crossing, carrying its lessons to wider horizons, of the daughter who had found her calling in continuing their work, of the community that had taught him the true meaning of development, not just of land, but of human potential. The triplets have a saying, Richard replied. Something Sarah taught them. The right path isn't always the easiest one. As they walked back to join the others, the saguaro cactus stood sentinel behind them, its arms raised against the star-filled sky, a silent witness to how suffering could be transformed into growth, and how the harshest desert could yield the most unexpected blessings. 10 years had passed since Richard Sullivan woke bound to a desert cactus. The silver in his hair had become more pronounced, smile lines, replacing the worry creases that had once marked his face. Today, he stood proud in his academic regalia, having been invited to deliver the commencement address at Arizona State University's School of Community Development, a program that had flourished in partnership with the Sullivan-Williams Foundation. From his vantage point on the stage, Richard could see Margaret in the front row, elegant and purposeful at 65. Beside her sat Chloe, now 35, and recently appointed to the governor's task force on affordable housing. Frank and Betty, both in their 70s but still active in community affairs, rounded out the family section. His gaze, however, kept returning to 3 identical figures seated side by side, distinguished now by their different academic regalia: Jack in Harvard Crimson, Jason in MIT Gray, and Joshua in Stanford Cardinal. The triplets, now 28, had completed not just their undergraduate degrees, but advanced studies in their chosen fields. After the ceremony, surrounded by well-wishers and students inspired by the Winter's Crossing model, Richard found a moment alone with the 3 young men who had changed everything. "Your mother would be so proud of you," he said, emotion thickening his voice. Jack, whose law degree had already helped establish housing rights clinics in 3 states, smiled. "We think of her every day, especially when we're working with families who remind us of our own." Jason, whose environmental engineering innovations were revolutionizing sustainable desert housing, nodded. "Everything we accomplish is built on her foundation, on how she taught us to care for each other and our community." Joshua, whose work in trauma psychology had helped countless children navigate loss and change, added softly, "And on what you showed us about transformation, Richard, about how it's never too late to change direction." The Sullivan-Williams model had expanded far beyond Winter's Crossing in the decade since its inception. 50 communities across the American Southwest now implemented variations of their approach, combining affordable housing with sustainability, educational access, and community ownership. The triplets had been instrumental in this expansion, each bringing their unique expertise to the growing movement. That evening, a private celebration gathered the extended family at the original cabin where the triplets had once survived alone. Now preserved as a reminder of their journey, it stood adjacent to the thriving community they had helped create. As twilight settled over the desert, the 4 siblings, for Chloe and the triplets, had indeed become family in every way that mattered, walked together to a special place near the edge of the development. There, under a mesquite tree, lay a simple stone marker for Sarah Winters, finally given a proper memorial in the land she had loved. Joshua knelt beside the marker, placing a small bouquet of desert wildflowers. "Mom," he said softly, That cup of water we offered changed not just one life, but thousands. Jack added, your lessons about kindness and forgiveness created ripples we never could have imagined. Jason completed the thought. And your strength lives on in everything we build. As they stood in silent remembrance, Richard gazed out at Winter's Crossing, at the homes filled with families who once faced displacement, at the community centre bustling with activity, at the solar arrays powering it all, and at the desert landscape that had been respected rather than conquered. Children played in the Central Park, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Among them were descendants of the original community alongside newcomers, creating bonds that transcended the divisions Richard had once taken for granted. The setting sun cast long shadows across the desert floor, turning the saguaro cacti into sentinels standing watch over this place of transformation. A new generation was growing up with different values and possibilities, learning that communities could be built on compassion rather than competition. As darkness fell and stars appeared in the vast desert sky, Richard understood that his greatest accomplishment had nothing to do with buildings or business success. It lay in the healing of wounds he had once created, in the transformation of destruction into growth, and in the simple truth that had saved him. Even in the harshest landscapes, acts of kindness could take root and flourish, changing not just individual lives, but the very ground beneath their feet. The circle that had begun with 3 identical boys offering water to a dying man had expanded beyond anything they could have imagined, and would continue long after them. A living testament to the power of forgiveness, second chances, and the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to transform even the deepest wounds into sources of healing.